What a moment. The NIL, and you've discussed a lot of things in my last question for you. The NIL is obviously right now, it's been described as the wild, wild west. Is there any chance whatsoever that genie, at least part of it, a body part of it, can get back in the bottle and maybe have more guardrails in the future?
Well, that's certainly what we're all working on, is to one, we've learned a lot from the process. I don't know that we should be surprised by what happened, but I think we've learned a lot, and it's helped us understand, where the problems are and where we need to try to put some guidelines or guardrails around it that will help us manage this better going forward, so that it's a fair process. Student athletes are truly getting legitimate NIL money for legitimate activities they're engaged in that add value, and then it's not used as a pure recruiting inducement, which it was never intended to be. That was never what anybody was asking for, even folks outside of athletics. And so, we sent out the board put out some guidelines recently to reemphasize what the policy was and what should and shouldn't be happening. And it gave the enforcement staff some guidance. But I think we're going to have to continue to work with universities and the athletic departments and their compliance staff to educate and help student athletes understand what's expected. And, and we continue to have conversations about whether any legislation could be helpful or not. And I think as people have seen what's happened, it gives you a better sense of where the challenges are and where there are opportunities for us to try to align things better with what the actual real intent of NIL is. So, and it's been perverted some in some instances. I do think in most cases, for most sports, it's working like it's supposed to. We hear about the really high profile ones and the ones that are probably a bit out of the lanes of what's intended. But I think for most student athletes, and again, in most sports, it's working the way it's supposed to be. And we're working really hard at Baylor to make sure what's working with our student athletes is appropriate, and it's true engagement that they're doing to add value to earn the money that they're being paid. And we've got a great team working on that. Mac and his team have put together great education. We also want student athletes not to be exploited in this process or taken advantage of in some way that they're not really prepared to do or not getting good advice on. And that's important for us, too, to protect our student athletes in ways that allow them to do this in a healthy way as it's intended.
Yeah, and he's also mentioned to make sure that Baylor, among many other schools, is not left behind. Even though, some schools have more, is there any concern that the haves are just becoming bigger than the have-nots?
I mean, it's always a concern. I do think, it'll be interesting to see what happens. Sometimes these things early on kind of get a little out of control as it's new and people don't know how it's going to work. And then things settle down as everybody understands how it's going to work and how we want to best work with student athletes. So I think we also have to be a little careful not to overreact to what's happening now, given how new everything is. And there's the interaction with the transfer portal as well, which, I think if you had either the transfer portal open like it is or NIL, you wouldn't be seeing all of this like you are. But I think those two kind of intersecting with one another at the same time without understanding the impact either one of those would have by themselves has made this more complicated. So I think, there's efforts both as we think about how to manage the transfer portal so it's fair to student athletes, but also helps coaches manage their rosters a little better, and how we think about NIL. Hopefully we'll see it settle into a sort of a more normal and maybe appropriate model going forward.
Dr. Livingstone, thanks for your time. We appreciate it very much. Dr. Linda Livingstone.